Hello everyone. Under this module, you will going to study about food poisoning and infection. Food infection and food poisoning are two different terms, but the both terms are in result related to a single disease, which is foodborne disease. Now, what is a foodborne disease? Any kind of contaminated food which contains the microorganism or the toxins and chemicals which is produced by the microorganisms or the spoiled food, which in results causes food infection and food poisoning. If we look into the term food infections and food poisonings, many a times it looks very similar word, but food infections and food poisoning are the two different terms with two different meanings. So in this module, we will going to study what is a food infection and what is a food poisoning. Food poisoning. Food poisoning is basically a disease which is caused by infections of a toxic chemicals which is present in the food is called as a food poisoning. In the food, there are some toxic chemicals which is produced by the microorganism. These toxic chemicals are responsible to causing or spoiling the food, and when all the spoiled food which is eaten by human beings, they suffer with a disease called as a food poisoning. This food poisoning is further divided into two types: chemical poisoning and food intoxication. Food poisoning can be done by many methods. Chemical poisoning means if a poisoning is caused by injections of a poison which is accidentally or either purposefully added in the food is called as a chemical poisoning. When in the food accidentally or purposely the poisons which is injected, example is the disease which is caused by injection of a rat poisons in food. Any kind of poisonous material, if indirectly or purposefully added in the food, is called as a chemical poisoning. If the poisoning is caused by injections of a toxin which is secreted by the living beings, is called as a food intoxication. Food intoxication means any kind of a toxin which is produced by the living beings or which is secreted by the living beings, means any kind of toxins which is produced by the microorganisms which is secreted by the microorganisms in the food, and in results these food causes the food poisoning is called as a food intoxication. Sometimes there are certain kinds of tissues in the food itself is a toxic and causes the intoxication. Examples is a mushroom poisoning. There are certain kinds of mushrooms which has the structural toxin in it, and in result it results into a poisoning. Some microorganism contaminates the food and produces the toxin in the food. It is also an example of a intoxication which is caused by injections of a microbial toxins in the food. So there are total two types of food poisoning, a chemical poisoning and intoxication. Chemical poisoning means when any kind of poison is injected into the food sample either indirectly or directly, and food intoxication means any kind of toxic chemicals which is secreted by the living beings is added into the food, and in result that food will cause the poisoning. Food infection. Now, food infection is on in all a very different terms than food poisoning. In the food infection, the disease is caused by ingestion of a viable microorganisms in food, and in results it will cause a food infection. Now, what is the meaning of ingestion of a viable microorganisms? Any food which is contaminated with the bacteria or the microorganisms which is harmful for the human body, when it enters into the human body, in results, it will going to cause a food infection. In the food infections, the microorganism which goes inside the body with the food will multiply in the intestinal tracts and it will causes the disease. Now, there are basically two types of food infection, invasive types and enterotoxigenic type. Enterotoxigenic types of food infection. It means when a microorganism will produce enterotoxins in the intestinal tract. It means microorganism which produce some kind of toxic chemicals which is harmful for the human body. When it enters into our intestinal tract, it will causes a disease. The example of an enterotoxigenic type is a food infection which is caused by a Vibrio chlorella. When these bacteria, when entered into the intestinal tract, it will enter with a toxin chemical which is bad for the human beings. In result, it will going to cause a food infection. The second type of food infection is an invasive type of food infection. In this type, the microorganism causes disease by invading through the intestinal tract. So, in the enterotoxigenic type, the toxin chemicals which was there in the food, it was causing an infection, whereas in the invasive type, the microorganism itself will causes the infection in the intestinal tract. The example is the food infection which is caused by Shigella. Now, in some foodborne diseases, food simply serves as a carriers of a microorganisms and microorganisms do not multiply in a food. So, in this, there are certain kind of food which is contaminated with the microorganism, bacteria, and now all these microorganism and bacteria through the food. Food is the main carrier of all these microorganisms and bacteria to enter into a human body. And the another foodborne diseases is a cultivation medium for a growth of microorganisms, or simply the microorganisms will multiply in the food. And there is one more type of foodborne diseases in which in the food microorganisms constantly replicate or multiply, and then it will enter into the human intestinal tract where again it will multiply and then it will causes some kind of food infection. So these are the different types of food infection where either a food is a carrier or a food is a cultivator, which in results going to cause a food infection. Now let's study the main difference between the foodborne diseases, which is food infection and food poisoning. Food infection is basically caused by the living microorganism, which is a bacteria, viral, or any parasite, whereas the food intoxication, which is a type of food poisoning, it is caused by the toxin which is produced either naturally or any kind of bacteria has produced some chemical toxins or any kind of chemicals which in results going to harm the human body. They invade or multiply in the living intestine, whereas the food intoxication, no invasion or no multiplication. So here, in the food infection, microorganisms are living in the food. When they go inside to the human's intestine, they will divide and multiply, and in result, they will going to cause a infection. Whereas in food poisoning, there is no living organism as such. There is just a toxic chemicals which is producing the infection. So there is no multiplication or no invasion of a microorganism. Incubation period is hours to the days, whereas in intoxication the incubation period is just minutes to hours. The main signs and symptoms of the food infection is diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps and fever. Whereas the signs and symptoms of food intoxication, which is food poisoning, is vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, weaknesses. Almost the signs and symptoms are little bit similar. There are slightly changes in that. Then the transmission of the food infection is done by spread from person to person, whereas the food poisoning or food intoxication is not communicable disease. It cannot be spread through person to person, whereas the food infection is a communicable disease. Now the factors: inadequate cooking, cross-contamination, poor personal hygiene, bare hand contact, all these are the causal organism of causing the food infection, whereas inadequate cooking, improper handling temperatures, these are the causes of food intoxication. So overall at the end, food infection and food poisoning are two different meaning, where the food infection is caused by a living organism which will go inside the human body and multiply, whereas the food poisoning is food intoxication, in that a toxic chemicals which is either naturally or it can be secreted from any bacteria, or it can be a toxic chemicals which will go from the food inside the human body, and in result it will going to cause a poison. So this is food infection and food poisoning. So here we end the topic food-borne infections and intoxication.